book of Daniel. Otherwise, all the verses are going to be on the screen, so you can follow. The. So we've been in this series, quite a long series. It's an attempt that I've always wanted to do, and I guess because now I'm Professor Dr. Reverend Berkovich, joking. I've really enjoyed, I don't know about you, but I've really enjoyed preaching and preparing, and it sounds crazy, but when I'm not preaching here, this series, I sort of have a withdrawal symptoms, because I had to preach something completely different in Tarkester. And we've been in this series called His Story, and looking at God's story through Scripture. And we started in Genesis, and we're finding ourselves today in Daniel. And last time we were together, before Tony preached here, we spoke about Judah, if you remember, as a kingdom, and all the problems that happened in Judah. And now we're moving into Daniel. And what happened is that, if you remember, we had David and Solomon. Remember David and Solomon? And Solomon had a son. Remember Solomon's son's name was? Rehoboam. Okay. And Rehoboam divided the kingdom, and we had Rehoboam in the southern kingdom, and we had a guy similar to his name, but his name was Jeroboam in the northern. And we have all of a sudden, from David and Solomon, who we had was one kingdom, now all of a sudden we find these two kingdoms, the southern kingdom and the northern kingdom. And the nation is now divided into two. And it's kind of the same thing that happens in the northern kingdom and in the southern kingdom. And they have a bunch of bad kings, and every now and again, and there is a good king, and then there's another bad king again. And then came those vessel kings. Remember we spoke about the vessel kings? Vessel kings where they just go like this, just to make me feel good that you remember, okay? Otherwise I'm like, I'm the only one who's enjoying doing this sermon, because we're like, you did? Vessel king? I don't remember vessel king. Okay, vessel king. The vessel kings were if the nations were not conquering. The Assyrians came in and they conquered, and what it did is they used the king that was there, whether he was a bad king or a good king, it doesn't matter. They really used him as a political figure, because that vessel king would basically do what the conquering army would tell him. Okay? And really what it was is to make sure that the taxes are being paid. So we had these vessel kings, and then Ezekiel, the prophet, prophesied for the time, and he speaks of God saying, enough disaster. Okay? Enough of this thing that is happening. And God comes to be known as the God who strikes. Okay? And we said the Hebrews there is Adonai Naka. Adonai is God, and Naka is strike or smite. It's more like, not like a gentle pat, but it's quite a strike. Okay? And if you remember last week, we also were asking the question, well, why does he do that? Okay? Because it seems as if God was willing to just sit back and take it in, and eventually he would do something about it. And we're thinking, well, why is he not, does it seem like he's not doing anything? Excuse me. And he said, well, we came to the conclusion that he's doing it to protect his name. Okay? This was not about making them pay for what they did wrong and for the sins, but rather about protecting his great and holy name. That's what really important for us to understand when it comes to God dealing or punishing. In our terms is a different way of punishing, but because God wants us to tell the right story of who he really is. Okay? And that's what we came out, hopefully, what you came out with last time we were here together. Then what happens, okay, and this is where we're going to sort of find ourselves today in, what happens is the Babylonian came and wiped the Assyrians out, okay? They wiped the Assyrians out, and we find the children of Israel being scattered all over the place. Some of them literally get shipped to Babylon and are held there as slaves. Others stay behind, but are scattered all over the place. So where the tribes used to be, they're not there anymore. Okay, they were completely taken to different areas, and it doesn't matter which tribe you were a part of. The Babylonians didn't care. They were in control of the land, and that's where you were going to stay. And as we find the Israelites now in Babylon, we now look at the book of Daniel. Okay, one of the things we see over and over is that God is faithful. God is faithful. You agree with that? He's so faithful in the story so far that even though there is these ups and downs, he seems to still be faithful. Sometimes we don't understand what is going on, but God is still faithful. Okay? But one of the things that we need to realize, because we tend to forget when we read this part of the Bible, is they are still slaves. Okay? And in a way, it was God who allowed this to happen, for them to be sent as slaves. And one of the assumptions we make about God's faithfulness is that God is faithful when we are on top of the world. Okay? I mean, if you look about it, if you think about it, when Jesus shows up on the scene in the first century, that was the expectation of the people. When the Messiah comes, when Jesus comes, or a Messiah figure comes, it will mean that he will restore them to the earthly powers. But that wasn't God's agenda, was it? Okay? So I would like to suggest that there are several lessons that we can learn from the book of Daniel. And not even just from the great stories that we already know, but just in general from the book of Daniel. We need to understand that our circumstances do not decide whether or not God has been faithful. Okay? God is faithful. Period. Regardless of our circumstances. And we need to know that as we look at Daniel, I hope that we're going to see that come about. I mean, we love the miracles and all that stuff in the book of Daniel, but the fact of the matter is that we are still slaves in the midst of all of that. Because when you read Daniel and you read all these wonderful stories that we grew up with, and if you've been in the church long enough, you know quite a lot of those stories. And if you've been ever a Sunday school teacher, you have taught those stories to the little ones, okay? And one of the things that we forget is that God is faithful in the midst of them being slaves. So I want you to hold on to that. There are several times along the story that we see that a king gets switched. There are several times along the story that we see that one king comes and then another king comes. So we start with Nebuchadnezzar, and then Belshazzar is his son, and then we get Darius, okay, the Persian king. And every time there is a new king, these guys, these Israelites, and maybe other slaves, they have to compromise, because there's new rules, new regulations, and they are the slaves in that country, so they have to compromise. So they have been given this decision: are you going to compromise or not? So we get to these great moments that God is going to use to show his faithfulness in this time, in this moment where they need to make a decision. Are they going to compromise regardless of their circumstances, or are they not? And we're going to talk about some of those. So we're going to start off with Daniel fasting. Okay? And by the way, next year we as a congregation, I'm hoping that we as a congregation are going to do the Daniel fast. Okay? Some of you guys are going, yay! And some of you are going, like I'm looking at someone, I'm not going to eat vegetables. Thank you very much. Okay? The meat eaters are going, hell on earth. Thank you. But we're going to do the Daniel fast, but I hope that you have an understanding that the Daniel fast is not just about eating vegetables. Okay? It's much more than that. So let's start with Daniel chapter 1, 1 to 17. Coming. Okay. Right. Daniel chapter 1, note 11, chapter 1. You got it, Daniel chapter 1 there. Okay, all right. Let me. If you are able to get me Daniel chapter 1, 1 to 17 is the first one. That's great. Let me start reading. In the third year of the reign of Joachim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged Jerusalem. And the Lord delivered Joachim, king of Judah, into his hands, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. Let's stop there. Why the articles from the temple of God? Well, here is why. Because in this time period, it's not so much about my nation conquering your nation, but rather it's about my God conquering your God. Okay? And how do we know that our God is better and stronger than your God? Well, what we're going to do is we first kick your behind, okay, and we take over your country, and then we take the most sacred things that represent your God, okay? And we take them and we put them in our temple of our God, okay? And if you think about it, this is why the Philistines kept on in the Old Testament, kept on taking the Ark of the Covenant. If you know that time of the period, there were about 3 or 4 times before the Ark of the Covenant was lost that the Philistines would carry on taking the Ark of the Covenant. Why? Because they wanted to say, we're going to take your stuff that represents your God, and we're going to put it in our temple that represents our God. So now we're sort of like subduing your God. Okay? The problem with the Ark of the Covenant is every time the Philistines took the Ark of the Covenant, they got really, really sick. Okay? So they wanted to give it back to the Israelites. And they kept on taking it, but they gave it back. So they conquered them and take some of the articles to Babylon. Are we there yet? No. Are we? Okay. Go down a bit. There. Okay. All right. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put it in the treasure house of his God. Then the king ordered Asaphan's chief of his court official to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility. Young men without any physical defense, there we go, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed and quick to understanding. In other words, if I was in the time of them taking people away, I would be the first one to be shipped off. Right? I wouldn't stand a chance to stay back. I mean, it says, what does it say there? Handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand. That's me down to the T. Huh? All right. So what they would actually do is they would take these kind of people. Why would they take these kind of people? I mean, joke aside, why would they take? Because they would use them in their own country. Okay? Obviously to breed other children and to work as engineers and so on and to work in the temple. Okay? And so it carries on and says, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that, they were to enter the king's advance. Among those who were chosen were some from Judah: Daniel, Ananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. You know them as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Okay? And the question is, why does Daniel get to keep his Hebrew name, but the other guys get these Babylonian names? Okay, that's a good question. So there are all kind of these questions that we see that the culture begins to influence them. Okay? And they literally get these names. You're not called Shadrach anymore. You're not called Manasseh anymore. You call this name. But Daniel, for some reason, gets to choose to keep his name. Why didn't the culture influence him? Well, we don't know. Carries on. It says officials gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Balthazar. To Ananiah, Shadrach. To Mishael, Meshach. And to Azariah, Abednego. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. Well, maybe there's the answer. He didn't want another name. And he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. Now, God had caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel. But the official told Daniel, I'm afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned you food and drinks. Why should he see you looking worse than the other man your age? So the assumption here is that what's going to happen, that he's going to start looking like really bad, because he's not eating what they're eating, so he's going to look like a vegetarian. Just joking. For those vegetarians out there, I'm just joking. Okay? But that was the assumption, is that if you're just going to eat that, you're not going to look good. Let's carry on. The king would then have my head because of you. Daniel then said to the guard, whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, and Ananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servant for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearances with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servant in accordance with what you see. So he agrees to this and tests them for 10 days. And at the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. Now say this word with me. Bari. All right. That's the word, the Hebrew word, that is used for healthier and better nourished. Okay? Now hang on to that word, bari. So the God took away the choice food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning. And Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. Now I want to show you, let me show you some examples of where the word bari is used, so that you can get some kind of understanding of what it means to be bari, okay, to be healthier and well nourished. The first one comes all the way from Genesis chapter 41. Okay, we got that one? Genesis 41. Oh, I might have been trying to multitask when, okay, sorry, I'm the one who put those there. I was multitasking and obviously not doing a very good job at that. Okay. And the next one is Judges 3:15 to 23. Is that right? Genesis 41, verses 1 to 3. And then straight after that will be Judges 3:15 to 23. All right, let's get to Genesis 41. There we go. 41, 1 to 3. When 2 full years had passed, now we studied this. We spoke about this quite a while ago when we started our series, when we spoke about Joseph. When 2 years have passed, Pharaoh had a dream. He was standing by the Nile when out of the river there came up 7 cows, sleek and fat, and they grazed among the reeds. After them 7 other cows, ugly and gaunt, came up out of the Nile and stood beside those on the riverbanks. Guess what word is used for fat? Bari. So now the question is, what does it mean, or what does it look like to be fat? Okay? Don't look at me, because we concluded that I'm not. But and Anthony just stood up, okay? Okay? Well, let's go to Judges 3:15 to 23. What does it mean, or what does it look like to be fat? Judges 3, yeah, all right. Again, the Israelites cried out to the Lord, and he gave them a deliverer, Ehud, a left-handed man, the son of Gera, the Benjamite. The Israelites sent him with the tribe to Eglon, king of Moab. Now, Ehud had made a double-edged sword about a cubit long. Now, a cubit is about 47 centimeters, okay? So keep that in mind. Which he strapped to his right thigh under his clothing. He presented the tribe to Eglon, king of Moab, who was a very fat. Now, what's the word used there? Bari. Okay? So he was very well nourished. Okay? And that's the word they use there. Okay? He was a very well nourished man. And here is something to think about. How fat is fat? Okay? I mean, how fat is fat? Well, let's have a look. After Ehud had presented the tribute, he sent on their way those who had carried it. But on reaching the stone image near Gilgal, he himself went back to Eglon and said, Your Majesty, I have a secret message for you. The king said to his attendants, Leave us, and they all left. Ehud then approached him while he was sitting alone in the upper room of his palace and said, I have a message from God for you. As the king rose from his seat, Ehud reached with his left hand, drew the sword. Now remember, it was quite a big sword, okay, from his right thigh and plunged it into the king's belly. This Bari king, okay? And listen to this. This is lovely. This is lovely stuff. Even the handles sunk in after the blade. That's how well nourished he was, okay? And his bowels discharged. Hair did not pull the sword out, and the fat closed over it. Dylan is absolutely like. Then Ehud went out to the porch and shut the doors of the upper room behind him and locked them. That, my friends, is what fat looks like. That, my friends, is what Bari is. Okay? So now you have an understanding of Bari. Okay? Now let's go back to the story of Daniel. So when Daniel and his friends looked Bari after 10 days, it doesn't mean they looked super healthy because they ate vegetables. Okay? Sorry for those who have done the Daniel fast for that reason. Okay? We're not talking about going on a Daniel fast to look great and healthier, although that can help. And let me tell you, Tammy and I went on a Daniel fast about 2-3 years ago, and we're not feeling healthier at all. Okay? And we didn't look it either. Okay? But rather, when the guy came back, they looked fat. Okay? let's not forget that fat in the ancient world is a sign of wealth and health. Okay? Once again, Anthony, there we go. Okay? Because only people who had money could eat like that. Okay? So in those days when they were talking about someone who was fat, it's not necessarily like obese or anything like that. It was that they were well nourished. Okay, they were like enjoying life. They were enjoying everything of life, and food and all of that was a part of it. And that's why the culture was. That's the way the culture was in those days. What we forget when we read about this passage is that God shows up and did a miracle. Think about it. God shows up even when they were just eating vegetables, and yet they looked fatter than they should have, because God is faithful, isn't He? Because they were not willing to compromise their conviction, even in the midst of terrible circumstances. They were not willing to compromise their conviction. This is the benchmark of Daniel and his friends. As we're going to continue seeing, this is what it's about. Now, there are some great stories in the book of Daniel, and if you are into the end times stuff, then this is the kind of book you want to read, okay? This is the book all about end time kind of things and weird things and stuff like that. But I want us to look at three of the famous stories that we already know of Daniel. And the first one is the one with the fiery furnace, okay? And you know the story. I mean, you've done it from Sunday school and you know the story. What happened, okay, for those who don't know the story, what happened is that Nebuchadnezzar is now the king, and he makes a giant golden statue of himself. And some of his counselors trick him to passing a law that all the people need to come in front of the statue and worship. And Daniel and his three friends refused to do that. But we don't see Daniel in the furnace, right? Okay? Because, I mean, we see the three guys going in there, and we don't see Daniel, okay? And we're wondering, well, why wasn't Daniel not there? Well, we're not sure why he wasn't there. So they refuse and they say no to the king about buying in front of the statue. And we can pick up the story in Daniel chapter 3, verse 16 to 18. Have we got that one? Right. I must have been on my own when I started this one. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and He will deliver us from your majesty's hands. I mean, look at that confidence in their God. We're not going to do it. We just refuse to do it. So if you want to do it, if you want to throw us, okay? So He's able, they said He's able to, okay? He can and He will. Now, we always believe God can do anything, but we're not always sure that He will. Am I right? He is able to do it, and He will. Listen to this. But even if He does not, we want you to know, Your Majesty, that we will not serve your God or worship the image of gold you have set up. Don't you love that? We know He's able to, but even if for whatever reason He doesn't, we're not going to question our God. If He doesn't deliver us, then He's obviously got a reason. Listen carefully. He says, we will not bow down. So it's not about whether God is going to show up or not. We're just not going to bow down. We're just not going to do it. Now, what they did is heat up the furnace 7 times hotter. Okay? And the question is, well, how did they know? Did they have a thermometer in there, or what? Or is it because the number 7 maybe has a completely different meaning to it? It's something you can think about. It was so hot that the guards who accompanied them died on the way to the furnace. So my question is, here's the guards on each side, and these 3 guys walking in, and it gets so hot that these 2 guards just collapse and die. What would you do? Run away. Run away. There's no guards. Run, Forrest, run. Okay? But they didn't run. Okay? And somehow the king is able to see in. Okay? Don't ask me how, but he does, and he sees 4 people in there. Okay? Now Daniel is not in there. So who's the 4th person? The 4th had the appearance of God. So the question is, was it an angel? Or was it a Christophany? You know what a Christophany is? No? Okay, we'll tell you what a Christophany is. Okay? Well, a Christophany is basically an appearance of Christ in the Old Testament. Okay? So now you can walk out here and you can share the book of Daniel and just look really smart and say, it was a Christophany. Okay, so you can look really, really smart. But his appearance of Jesus in the Old Testament is called a Christophany. So they survive the furnace, and they bring them out, and God is faithful, and we cheer for God, right? But guess what? The next morning, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are still slaves. They didn't get a special reward for surviving the fire. We're not made into anything great. We're not heroes or anything. They are still slaves. And we tend to forget that. The circumstances did not all of a sudden become awesome. And they had to decide, what will they let determine their reality? God's faithfulness or the fact that they are still slaves? They had to wrestle with that every single day. So do we, don't we? I know I struggle with that every single day. Do I compromise? Do I allow the circumstances to determine what their reality is? Or do I allow God's faithfulness that I know has been there and will continue being there determine? Well, Daniel 5, the king Nebuchadnezzar dies, and we have a new king, his son, which means what? That there's going to be another test, right? Every time there is a new king in the book of Daniel, there is a test for these guys to see if they're going to continue being faithful to their God. So this new king has a banquet, and this big hand comes and writes something on the wall. You know the writing on the wall? Okay. Daniel 5:18 to 28. Let's go through that. Your Majesty, the Most High God, gave your father Nebuchadnezzar sovereignty and greatness and glory and splendor. Because of the high position he gave him, all the nations and the people of every language dreaded and feared him. Those the king wanted to put to death, he put to death. Those he wanted to spare, he spared. Those he wanted to promote, he promoted. And those he wanted to humble, he humbled. But when his heart became arrogant and hardened with pride, he was disposed from the royal throne and stripped of his glory. He was driven away from people and given the mind of an animal. He lived with the wild donkeys and ate grass like the ox, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven, until the knowledge that the Most High God is sovereign over all kingdom on earth and set over them anyone he wishes. But you, Belshazzar, his son, have not humbled yourself. Though you knew all this, instead you have set yourself up against the Lord of heaven. You had a goblet from the temple brought to you, and you and your nobles, your wives and your concubines drank wine from them. You praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which cannot see or hear or understand. But you did not honor the God who holds in your hand your life and all your ways. Therefore he sends the hand that wrote the inscription. This is the inscription that was written. Mene, mene, tekel, parzim. Here is what these words mean. Mene, God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Perez, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and to the Persians. Mene, mene, tekel, parzim. Now the best way I remember at varsity to remember it is mene, mene, tickle my Pharisee. Okay? So mene, mene, tickle my Pharisee is how you remember it. But it's mene, mene, tekel, parazim. Now, if you think about it, Daniel could have said anything he wanted about the interpretation, because none of the wise men could have interpreted, right? Okay? But he chose to tell the truth, okay, of what it really was. And he didn't hold back. Once again, he didn't compromise in the face of his circumstances. He told the truth. And so let's finish off with Daniel chapter 6, verse 13 to 22, the well-known Daniel and the lion's den. And we'll finish there. Then they said to the king, Daniel, he is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, your majesty, or to your decrees, or to your writings. He still prays 3 times a day. When the king heard this, he was greatly distressed. He was determined to rescue Daniel and made every effort until sundown to save him. Then the men went up as a group to King Darius and said to him, Remember, your majesty, that according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, no decree or edict that the king can issue can be changed. So the king gave the order. They brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, May your God, whom you serve, continually rescue you. The stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den. Does that sound familiar? Stone being placed over a cave? What is that again? What's that word? Christophany. Okay, remember? Yeah. And the king sealed it with his own signet ring. Does that sound familiar? Sealing it? And with the ring of his nobles, so that Daniel's situation might not be changed. Does that sound familiar? Okay. Then the king returned to his palace and spent the night without eating and without any entertainment being brought to him. And he could not sleep. At the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. When he came near the den, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God whom you serve continually been able to rescue you from the lions? And Daniel answers, May the king live forever. My God sent his angel and he shut the mouth of the lion. They have not hurt me because I was found innocent in his sight, nor have I ever done any wrong before you, your majesty. Beautiful, beautiful story. God did an amazing thing, and Daniel came out of the pit, and guess what happened after that? He was still a slave the next day. He was still a slave. So once again we get to pick, even in the midst of slavery, What are we going to choose to determine reality? Our circumstances or the truth of the fact that God is a faithful God? Because all these stories, they went back to be slaves. It's much later on that Daniel eventually became an official within the court. And we will look at that next Sunday, where now they are allowed to come back home. The king eventually issues a decree that allowed these guys from exiles to go back and build Jerusalem again. But up to this time, every time God was faithful, the next day was just the same old thing. They were still slaves. And guess what? God is still looking for people who, regardless of the circumstances, are willing to trust His story. And that's why He uses Daniel. That's why we read about Daniel and his friends, because in the midst of their circumstances, they say, my God, faithfulness, my reality, and not my circumstances. Because circumstances can be really good or really bad, right? So the question I want to leave with you for this week is, what determines your reality? What determines your reality? Circumstances? Or the faithfulness that you know God? It might not look like He's doing anything. Might not look like things are changing, because the next day it's the same kind of day. Circumstances have not changed. But as the faithfulness of your God changed, as your understanding of Him changed. So what determines your reality? I'll let you wrestle with that this week as you go back to your week. Are you going to allow the circumstances to determine your week? Or are you going to allow the faithfulness of your God to determine your week? Amen? Right. We're going to sing our last